It will be nearly a year since Ukraine and Russia went to war. Actually, to put that factually correctly, it will be nearly a year since Russia invaded Ukraine. That anniversary of the war will fall on the 24th of February. But nearly a year later, there is no doubt that both sides are digging their heels in. The biggest example of this and the biggest symbol of this came in the form of a surprise visit by the President of the United States, Joe Biden, who landed unexpectedly in Kyiv today. During that 5-hour visit, Joe Biden made it absolutely amply clear that the United States will stand by Ukraine. They will in fact give them more money to continue fighting the war. They will also look at further sanctions against Russia. So 1 year later, what is the picture emerging like? To speak on this, I'm joined today by Meera Shankar, former ambassador to the United States, Jayan Das Gupta, former ambassador and former permanent representative of India at the WTO. I'm also joined today by Nandan Unnikrishnan, distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. But before I go to my panelists, let me just play out for you important statements which came in today from Joe Biden and, of course, Zelenskyy.
The world was literally at the time bracing for the fall of Kyiv. Seems like a lot longer ago than a year, but think back to that year. Perhaps even the end of Ukraine. You know, 1 year later, Kyiv stands, and Ukraine stands. Democracy stands. The Americans stand with you, and the world stands with you. Kyiv has captured a part of my heart, I must say.
Переговори з паном президентом Сполучених Штатів Америки в форматі тет-а-тет, а потім в розширеному форматі. Це була розмова, яка дійсно наближає нашу спільну перемогу в цій війні. Ми можемо і маємо зробити так, щоб саме цей рік, 23-й, став роком перемоги. І я хочу підкреслити, ця неспровокована і злочинна російська війна проти України, всієї Європи та демократичного світу має завершитись очищенням всієї української землі від окупації Росії та твердими гарантіями довготривалої безпеки, як нашої держави, так і усієї Європи і всього світу.
Let's begin. Ambassador Shankar, how do you look at the surprise visit of the President of the United States, that too in the middle of an active conflict zone? What is the message that Joe Biden is trying to send?
I think the message that Joe Biden is trying to send is very clear, that the U.S. is with Ukraine all the way. He reiterated in his little statement that the U.S. stands by Ukrainian democracy, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, and promised to give more weapons, more aid, $500 million, the details of which will come out subsequently this week, and to impose more sanctions. Now, this comes at a time when we've had reports in the last 10 days or so about Russia having broken through 2 defense lines of Ukraine in the eastern part of Ukraine, after Ukraine had earlier taken back territory from Russia. And there was a hard slog. It also comes amidst reports that Ukraine has been facing a shortage of ammunition and that European production lines are too stretched to be able to fulfill all their requirements. So I think one of the things that President Biden has said is that he will be providing ammunition for artillery and so on. Finally, it comes at a time when Putin, it's the first anniversary of this conflict, and Putin is getting ready to talk to the Russian people about the conflict. From our point of view, I think it would have been perhaps more desirable for saner voices to prevail and for some efforts to start winding down the conflict and begin discussions on a ceasefire and subsequent discussions on a possible solution. But the way things are going, with a Russian offensive poised to take off shortly, and the Americans and Europeans upping the ante in terms of supply of weapons to Ukraine, I fear that the conflict is going to escalate. And on the other side, you have the Chinese foreign minister visiting Russia. And there are reports that China may be mulling the supply of equipment, defense equipment to Russia, including lethal equipment. And this is something about which Antony Blinken has warned the Chinese in a meeting on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference, saying there will be consequences. Well, we don't know if they will really do it, because till now they've kind of kept the importance of the economic link with the US in their mind and tried to balance between the two sides with a tilt towards Russia. How far that tilt will go, I think we have to wait and see. But if it does, then it really presages a broadening of the conflict, which is worrisome, and a deepening of the conflict because of the escalation of weaponry.
You know, that's really the concern. 1 year down the line, we're very far from any kind of a resolution or any kind of a solution at all. A year ago, a lot of experts and analysts were supposing that Russia would end the war in a very short time because it is vastly better armed than Ukraine. But the Western world has stood behind Ukraine, and they have seen billions of dollars worth of weapons pumped into their side. The Russians are now conscripting more and more people, including prisoners, to come and fight their war. Jayan Das Gupta, will China getting involved be the absolutely worst case scenario? And from Joe Biden's demeanor, from the message he's put out, he is saying that you were dead wrong to think that we would give in. A year later, everyone is digging in their heels.
Yes, in the initial phase, people had thought that Putin would be satisfied with just occupying the predominantly Russian-speaking regions of eastern Ukraine and securing a land link to Crimea. But the war dragged on, and it is not very clear as to what the Russians stand to gain by prolonging the war and not getting into talks. If China joins the war effort, because as Ambassador Meera Shankar pointed out, the ammunition issue is hurting the Ukrainian defense preparations. The Russians also are suffering from a similar kind of shortage. And that is perhaps what, because they use the same gauge of weapons and the same platforms, the Russians and the Chinese in many cases. So there is interoperability. So this would of course be, if the Chinese start supplying, this would just bolster Russia's efforts, Russia's preparedness in carrying forward the offensive, because it is likely that after spring, that is in another month's time, there would be a renewed effort to gain more ground in the eastern part of Ukraine. Whether President Putin extends that to central Ukraine and western Ukraine, that remains to be seen. But already there is so much of devastation. And that, I think, the other point which I wanted to mention is that the efforts that the NATO countries have made, of course, many countries have chipped in, but there seems to be a certain tiredness which is creeping in. And they are also, all of them are going through economic recession and other problems on the economic front. So I think President Biden's visit was a means of shoring up the resolve that we are there for the long haul. We will not leave Ukraine's side. They will not be left in the lurch. So I think it is a symbolic gesture, and also to shore up the flagging morale, perhaps, of some of the NATO allies.
Very interesting point. Mr. Krishnan, great to have you on the show. And if you look at it in perspective, 1 year down the line, what was the biggest concern globally coming out of this conflict? The price of gas, the price of commodities, what is going to be the impact of sanctions? Some of that fear seems to have ebbed. The worst of, war-fueled inflation seems to have ebbed, and those supply chain chokes seem to have ebbed. Would that be a fair assessment?
I don't know if you could say that they have ebbed, but I think what has happened is that the Russians have been able to keep up their supplies. So there is no shortage of gas or oil on the market. So in that sense, I think the market has survived. Additionally, of course, Europe is going through a mild winter, so the consumptions for heating is much less, and the market in a sense is much calmer than it was, let's say, in August and September. However, I would like to raise a couple of issues. Since I'm a scholar, I can be far more forthright than my ambassador friends. The United States is committed to helping Ukraine continue this war. And this is, of course, from the perspective of the Ukrainians and the Western Alliance, a commendable act. But if we are to look at it in a slightly different manner, I think any continuation of this war is harmful for the rest of the world. It's harmful for economic growth all around. And therefore, as it was said, saner voices should have prevailed. And it is in this context that I just wanted to point out one minor thing, that in March last year, March or April last year, there was an agreement brokered by the Turks, which was initialed by the foreign ministers of Russia and Ukraine. It took a visit by Boris Johnson, then Prime Minister, for Zelenskyy to walk away from that agreement, which his people had agreed to. So it is also quite clear that if the United States decides that Russia has been sufficiently weakened and that now is the time to start some kind of negotiations, I think the key in that sense is with the United States. And finally, I do not think China is ever at this point of time going to supply any kind of weaponry to Russia and jeopardize its relationship with the United States. I think Anthony Blinken's statement about China preparing to supply lethal weapons is to a distraction from the disastrous event of having fired multi-million-dollar missiles at toy balloons over Canada and the United States. So, I mean, it's effective, that there is no doubt about, but China is not going to shoot itself in the foot at this point of time.
Yeah, I love the sort of frank assessment coming from you, Mr. Krishnan, and it's an interesting way to look at it, that the US is trying to sort of cover its tracks and raise that Chinese bogey. Where does this end, though? Ambassador Shankar, then where is the end? Because clearly from day one, the United States doesn't seem keen to broker peace at all. They're quite happy to use this situation to attack Russia as well. If you go by what Mr. Krishnan is saying, that they will only stop when they think Russia is sufficiently weakened. Is that coming around the corner, or is this going to be one of many anniversaries of this war that the world will note?
We can't say at this stage, but clearly the US objective is to fight this war with Russia by proxy through the Ukrainians, to weaken Russia, and perhaps to have a change in Putin's leadership. I mean, it's fairly clear what they want. Other objectives they have already achieved, severing the energy links between Russia and Europe, including the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which I think was the central point at issue. and consolidating the NATO alliance under US leadership, getting Europe to spend more on defense. So they have achieved a number of objectives in terms of their policy. And since it's not a war which touches them directly, I think they may be prepared to continue it. But the only check probably would come if the Congress, the House of Representatives in particular, which is now controlled by the Republicans, and where some far-right Republican group really is the tail which wags the dog of the Republican Party, start putting pressure on this blank check, as the Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, has said, we are not going to allow this kind of blank check policy to Ukraine. But how far they would go, given that, public opinion in the US has been mobilized, if I may say, in favor of the war, I'm not sure.
The real question now, and Ambassador Dasgupta, let me come to you on this, is how far is Russia willing to take this? We've seen Biden sort of preempt what Putin will say, perhaps in a few days from now. What do you think Putin's message will be?
I think President Putin, if I'm not wrong, a few months ago, did mention his, in a very tangential manner, his inclination or his willingness to look at a negotiated settlement. And as Mr. Unnikrishnan mentioned, in March or April last year, the Turks had got some negotiations going. I think President Putin also realizes that he has to have an honorable exit from Ukraine. He can't win the war. There would be further devastation of Ukrainian infrastructure. A lot more people will get killed. The Russians are also facing a problem in their own ranks in terms of conscription and the other issues. And sooner or later, the sanctions will start biting and causing hardship to the Russian people as well. So I think if Putin is offered an honorable exit, which, and which brings to mind what Henry Kissinger has mentioned in February 2022, just when the war had started, that this can only be solved through negotiations. So the central point is whether the US is willing to offer an honorable exit to Russia, or it is going to further weaken Russia to the point where they're satisfied that it will not pose any further danger to the NATO or the US. And also to send a message to the Chinese that this is what the US can do on the European front, and beware of what can happen on the Pacific front.
Mr. Unnikrishnan, are you optimistic of 2023 being the year of resolution? Do you think both sides have had enough?
Tamanna, I'm not an astrologer, so I am not going to risk any kind of predictions. But I think Ambassador Dasgupta had mentioned earlier that the Russians were keen to take the Russian-speaking areas and a land link to Crimea. I think they have reached part of that objective. There is still some areas that they have to take. I mean, constitutionally, they actually have incorporated these areas into the Russian Federation. These 4 districts of Donbass, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye have been incorporated as part of Russia, and constitutionally, they're part of the Russian Federation. But the Russian troops don't control up to the administrative borders of these 4 entities. So I think the immediate Russian objective would be to get there. It is a war of attrition. There is no doubt about it. For Russia, this is an existential war. There is no, I don't know how to say this, but there is no way the current regime will survive if the objective of getting to those administrative borders is not met. So that is one aspect. The second is militarily, it looks like that objective is likely to be met by probably maybe September, October this year. So will peace break out? I don't know. It's definitely not breaking out through Blinken and Sullivan. So what we need to watch is what is Mr. William Burns doing? And that will give everyone indications as to where the peace process is headed.
Let's hope for some inkling of peace in the year 2023. Unfortunately, just as we are reaching the first anniversary of this war breaking out, the message that is coming through is of hardening positions on both sides. And that definitely is not the best of omens going forward. But I want to thank all of you for joining us today on the show and breaking down the surprise visit by the President of the United States to Kyiv just days before the first anniversary of the Ukraine-Russia war. Thank you.